What can $150 buy these days? A decent dinner or a full tank of gas? But for me, that money bought a one-way ticket into the vicious underworld of the elite and the chance to personally crush an untouchable billionaire. It started with the cold beep of a barcode scanner and ended with steel handcuffs. If you think this is a cliché fairy tale, brace yourself. The sweetest revenge begins in aisle 4. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Claire Holmes. I am 38 years old, and until recently, I spent my days suffocating under the fluorescent lights of Aegis Vanguard Analytics. As a risk data analyst, my entire existence revolved around finding anomalies in corporate ledgers, a thankless job where my male superiors routinely claimed credit for my late-night discoveries while treating me like an expendable piece of office furniture. But the data never lied, and my ability to read the violent, hidden stories buried beneath the numbers was a skill that would soon drag me into a living nightmare. It was a Tuesday night in Spokane, Washington. The sky was vomiting a miserable, freezing mixture of sleet and rain, the kind of weather that chills the marrow in your bones and makes the city look like a graveyard. I had stopped at a local Walmart just past midnight to grab some basic toiletries, seeking a brief refuge from the empty, freezing apartment waiting for me across town. The store was a cavernous void, smelling of floor wax and stale popcorn. The harsh overhead lights buzzed like dying insects, casting long, sickly shadows across the linoleum. I was wandering down aisle 4, my boots squeaking against the wet floor, when I heard it. A sharp, authoritative voice cutting through the quiet hum of the store, followed by the muffled, frantic plea of a woman. My instincts, honed by years of sniffing out corporate discrepancies and hidden truths, pulled me toward the front of the store. Near the customer service desk, the door to the loss prevention office stood slightly ajar. I stopped by a display of cheap winter gloves and peered through the narrow crack. Inside the cramped, windowless room, a burly security guard stood over a young woman. She was clutching a baby, a 1-year-old boy wrapped in a faded, heavily pilled fleece blanket. The woman, whom I would later come to know as Maya, wore a paper-thin, olive-green jacket that offered zero protection against the brutal Spokane winter. She was trembling violently, but as I studied her face, I realized she was not shivering from the cold. She was vibrating with pure, unadulterated terror. On the gray metal desk between them sat the stolen goods. I expected to see cheap makeup or maybe some candy. Instead, there was a specialized pediatric nebulizer, several boxes of high-end hypoallergenic medical formula, and a few sterile syringes. The cash register receipt printed on the guard's monitor glowed brightly with the total $148.22. "You cannot just walk out with this stuff, lady," the guard barked, his thumbs hooked into his heavy-duty belt. "I have to call the police." "Please," Maya begged, her voice cracking under the weight of her panic. "My son Leo, he needs it. He cannot breathe without the machine. I just need to get him out of here. Please do not call the cops." I looked at Maya's eyes. In my line of work, I routinely interviewed desperate people trying to cover up embezzled funds. I knew the look of a petty thief caught in the act. This was not it. Maya's eyes were darting wildly, mapping the room, calculating exits. It was the look of a hunted animal that had just heard a twig snap in the dark. The police arriving meant something far worse to her than a simple shoplifting charge. It meant a death sentence. Before my rational brain could stop me, my feet moved. I pushed the heavy wooden door open, plastering a wide, relieved smile on my face. "Maya, my goodness! I have been looking everywhere for you," I exclaimed, marching right up to the desk with an air of complete confidence. The guard blinked, stepping back in sudden confusion. Maya froze, staring at me as if I were a ghost materializing from the drywall. "I am so sorry, sir," I said, smoothly pivoting to the guard while pulling my leather wallet from my wet coat. "My sister-in-law here is completely exhausted. My brother has been in the hospital, and she left her purse in my car. I was supposed to meet her at the registers, but I got lost in the hardware section." The guard frowned, his eyes narrowing in clear skepticism. She concealed the merchandise inside her coat. "Pregnancy brain and extreme sleep deprivation," I lied without missing a single beat, sliding my credit card onto the metal desk. "I will cover the $148.22 right now, plus whatever restocking fee you need to add on. Please let me just get her and my nephew home where they belong." The guard looked at the shiny credit card, then down at the crying baby. It was late. The paperwork for processing a shoplifter would keep him stuck in this windowless room for another 2 hours. With a heavy, exhausted sigh, he grabbed the handheld scanner. The cold beep of the barcode reader filled the room, sealing the transaction. 10 minutes later, we were standing outside in the freezing, sleet-covered parking lot. The wind whipped mercilessly across the asphalt, biting at my cheeks like needles. I handed Maya the heavy plastic bags. "You do not have to do this," Maya said, her voice barely a whisper against the roaring wind. She refused to meet my gaze, keeping her eyes fixed on the icy ground. "You needed help," I replied softly. "Do you have a safe place to go? I can pay for a motel room for a few nights." "No," she snapped, pulling little Leo tighter against her chest, treating my offer like a physical threat. "Stay away from me." She turned abruptly and hurried toward the darkest corner of the parking lot. I stood frozen in the sleet and watched her approach an old, battered gray Honda sedan. As she hit the unlock button and the taillights flickered on, the red glow illuminated the rear bumper. My eyes narrowed immediately. The license plate was completely wrong. The metal around the numbers was warped and discolored, the reflective paint bubbling in a very specific, deliberate pattern. It was a chemical wash. Someone had used highly corrosive industrial acid to meticulously alter the digits on the plate, turning 3s into 8s and changing the letters to create a ghost vehicle. That was not the desperate act of a homeless mother stealing baby formula. That was a professional, highly sophisticated evasion tactic designed to defeat automated license plate readers and satellite tracking. Maya buckled her son into the car seat, then paused. She stood behind the open driver's side door, the icy rain matting her dark hair to her forehead. She looked back at me, her face pale and haunted under the flickering amber light of a distant street lamp. "Do not tell anyone you saw me tonight," she said, her voice slicing through the cold air with terrifying, absolute clarity. "If you do, they will not let you live." She slammed the heavy metal door, threw the car into drive, and vanished into the freezing black mouth of the Spokane night, leaving me standing alone in the snow, a meaningless plastic receipt clutched tightly in my trembling hand. 3 days passed in a haze of paranoid silence. Every shadow in my apartment felt like a threat. Then, on a freezing Thursday morning, the illusion of safety shattered completely. I was pouring my first cup of black coffee when the deep guttural rumble of heavy diesel engines vibrated through my floorboards. I approached the frosted window of my second-story apartment and peered through the blinds. Parked illegally across my driveway were 2 massive, matte black sport utility vehicles. The reinforced suspension and thick window tint screamed aftermarket armor. Before I could process the threat, a man built like a concrete pillar stepped out of the lead vehicle. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that barely concealed the bulky outline of a shoulder holster. He walked directly to my front door. My intercom buzzed. I did not answer, but a moment later, I heard heavy footsteps ascending the stairs, followed by a sharp, precise knock. I opened the door, keeping the chain engaged. The man did not try to push his way in. Instead, he slid a thick, cream-colored envelope through the narrow gap. The flap was sealed with a heavy stamp of blood-red wax bearing a military insignia. "Ms. Holmes," the man said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You are requested. We leave in 5 minutes." I tore the envelope open. Inside was a single piece of heavy cardstock with a handwritten note. It read, "I have answers about the $150. Come with my men. You have my word you will be safe." It was signed by General Marcus Vance. General Vance was not just a name. He was a phantom of modern military history. He was a retired United States Air Force intelligence legend, the kind of man who used to topple foreign governments before breakfast. Why would a man who operated in the highest, darkest echelons of global power care about my late-night grocery run? My curiosity, sick and fatalistic, overrode my terror. I grabbed my coat and stepped out into the biting cold. The drive lasted 2 hours. We crossed the state line into Idaho, ascending into the treacherous, snow-choked mountains surrounding Coeur d'Alene. The deeper we drove into the alpine wilderness, the heavier the silence became. We finally turned off the main highway onto an unmarked private road, flanked by towering, ice-covered pines. This was not a neighborhood. It was a fortress. We passed through 3 separate checkpoints. I watched the driver press his thumb against biometric scanners and speak into encrypted radios, while men in tactical winter gear and carrying assault rifles patrolled the perimeter with trained attack dogs. The vehicles finally halted in front of a sprawling glass and timber mega mansion built directly into the side of a sheer cliff. The suited man escorted me through massive double doors into a cavernous living room that smelled of burning cedar and expensive leather. A roaring fire crackled in a stone hearth the size of my kitchen. I stopped dead in my tracks. Sitting on a plush velvet sofa, staring into the flames, was Maya. She looked entirely different. The ragged, terrifyingly thin woman from the store was gone. Her hair was washed and styled, and she wore a luxurious, flowing silk lounge set. But her eyes still held that same haunted, fractured light. A few feet away, little Leo was sleeping peacefully in a handcrafted mahogany crib, swaddled in cashmere. "Maya?" I whispered, the word barely escaping my throat. Before she could answer, heavy, rhythmic footsteps echoed from the vaulted hallway. A man entered the room, and the air pressure seemed to drop instantly. General Marcus Vance was in his late 60s, with iron-gray hair and eyes as cold and gray as a winter ocean. He possessed a terrifying, quiet gravity. "She is safe now, Ms. Holmes. Thanks to you," the general said, his voice a deep baritone that commanded absolute obedience. He walked over and gently placed a hand on Maya's trembling shoulder. "You saved my daughter." The room spun. My analytical brain violently tried to piece the data together. Maya was the sole biological heir to one of the most powerful and wealthy intelligence figures in the United States. It made 0 sense. "If she is your daughter," I stammered, trying to regain my composure, "why was she stealing medical supplies in the middle of the night? Why the altered license plates? She told me she was going to be killed." The general's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering angrily in his cheek. Maya looked down at her hands, taking a shaky breath before she finally spoke. "I was not hiding from my father, Claire. I was hiding from my husband," Maya said, her voice laced with a venomous mix of fear and hatred. General Vance crossed the room and poured a measure of amber liquid into a crystal glass. "Her husband is Julian Sterling," he stated grimly. Julian Sterling. The name hit me like a physical blow. He was a ruthless tech finance titan, a Silicon Valley darling who had recently relocated to Seattle. He was a billionaire with a meticulously crafted public image of a philanthropic savior. "Julian is a monster," Maya continued, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the silk fabric of her pants. 2 years ago, I stumbled onto a hidden directory on his personal server. He has been systematically defrauding investors and the federal government for billions of dollars. When he realized I knew, he did not just file for divorce. He erased me. The pieces clicked into a horrifying picture. He froze your assets, I guessed. Maya nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. All of them. Every bank account, every trust fund. He cut off my access to the outside world. But worse, he paid off a team of corrupt, high-profile psychiatrists. They falsified medical records, claiming I was suffering from severe, violent postpartum psychosis. He was days away from having me legally committed to a private psychiatric lockdown facility where I would never see the light of day again, stripping me of my freedom and taking full custody of Leo. He needed me silenced permanently to protect his empire. General Vance crushed the crystal glass down onto the wooden bar with a violent thud, and because of those forged documents, he convinced me, his own father-in-law, that my little girl had lost her mind. I believed him. I let him isolate her. It was the greatest failure of my entire life. I had to run, Maya whispered. I have been living out of my car, using cash, avoiding cameras, terrified that Julian's private security contractors would find me. If I had used my real name or reached out to my father through normal channels, Julian's spyware would have flagged it, and his men would have intercepted me before I ever reached Idaho. I looked at the sleeping baby, then at the broken woman, and finally at the general. The $150 had not just bought baby formula, it had bought time. It had broken the digital silence, allowing Maya to reach the one place on Earth her husband could not touch her. "You brought me here for a reason, General," I said, my voice steadying as the risk analyst in me took over. "You have the guns. You have the money. Why do you need me?" The general turned to face me, his gray eyes locking onto mine with lethal intent. "Because, Ms. Holmes, bullets cannot kill a ghost in the financial system. We are not just going to save my daughter. We are going to burn Julian Sterling's empire to the ground." The general sank heavily into a leather armchair, the weight of his own monumental failure pressing down on his broad shoulders. For 24 torturous months, he confessed, his voice thick with a venomous mix of sorrow and rage. He had genuinely believed his daughter was residing in a high-security clinical facility in Europe, receiving the absolute best psychiatric care his immense wealth could provide. Julian had orchestrated a masterclass in deception. The billionaire had manufactured weekly medical updates, fabricated video consultations with actors playing elite doctors, and fed the old man a steady, comforting diet of lies, all while his private, heavily armed contractors relentlessly hunted Maya across the country. That Walmart in Spokane was an absolute statistical miracle, the general explained, gesturing to a massive topographical map spread across the oak table. It was situated perfectly within a localized electromagnetic dead zone, caused by the failing infrastructure of an outdated municipal power substation. That interference temporarily blinded the continuous satellite tracking array Julian uses to monitor her face. If Maya had swiped a debit card, or if the local police had processed her fingerprints, the municipal database would have instantly pinged his surveillance network. Your cash intervention kept her completely off the digital grid. But our window of opportunity was terrifyingly narrow. Maya, her voice no longer trembling but hardened by a cold, desperate resolve, explained the ticking clock hovering over our heads. Julian was exactly 14 days away from finalizing a colossal, unprecedented medical technology merger with the United States Department of Defense. Once the ink dried on those federal contracts, he would be instantly enveloped in top-tier government security protocols. He would become legally, financially, and politically untouchable. If that merger went through, Maya would remain a hunted fugitive for the rest of her natural life, or worse, she would end up buried in a shallow, unmarked grave. I needed to find a structural weakness in an empire that looked invincible. I began to pace the length of the cavernous living room, my mind rapidly sorting through thousands of data points, corporate organizational charts, and server logs I had memorized over my grueling years as a risk analyst. Suddenly, a chaotic string of seemingly unrelated data points aligned perfectly in my head. "Wait," I said. stopping dead in my tracks. Julian's primary holding firm, the one responsible for sheltering all of his domestic assets. Does it route its preliminary compliance audits through a third-party risk assessment vendor called Horizon Data Group? Maya frowned, her brow furrowing as she searched her memory. Yes, he used them extensively. How could you possibly know that? A cold, predatory smile slowly crept onto my face. Because Horizon outsources their massive risk overflow directly to my employer, Aegis Vanguard Analytics. 2 years ago, I was forced to audit a massive, fragmented data dump that came through our secondary, outdated server network. I clearly flagged several glaring anomalies and hidden offshore transfers in the ledger, but my arrogant boss buried the report to keep the client happy. Julian's entire dirty financial footprint passed right through my cubicle. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. We were no longer just a terrified victim, a grieving father, and a random bystander swept up in the chaos. We had organically formed a highly specialized, lethal task force. We now possessed the General's limitless shadow resources and tactical network, Maya's intimate, terrifyingly detailed knowledge of Julian's psychological blind spots and daily habits, and my own surgical capability to dissect his digital life. The General walked silently to a heavy biometric steel safe bolted into the corner of the room. He pressed his thumb to the scanner, unlocked the heavy door, and pulled out a suppressed tactical pistol. He laid the cold, black weapon deliberately on the mahogany table between us. "Give me the word, Ms. Holmes and I will have a team of my best operators breach his Seattle penthouse tonight. We can easily make it look like a violent robbery gone wrong." I stared at the weapon for a long moment, then looked directly into the General's cold gray eyes. "No, absolutely no physical violence. That is my ironclad condition for doing this." The old intelligence soldier narrowed his eyes, clearly displeased. "A man like that deserves to bleed, Ms. Holmes." "And he will," I replied sharply, matching his intense gaze. "But if you shoot him, he simply dies a martyr. A tragic, brilliant tech visionary cut down in his absolute prime. His fraudulent legacy remains perfectly intact, and society mourns a monster. I do not want to just end his biological life. I want to utterly destroy his reality. I want to strip him of his unearned reputation, vaporize his billions, and shatter his arrogant pride in the middle of broad daylight. I want him to watch his precious empire crumble into worthless dust, knowing he is completely powerless to stop the bleeding." Maya looked at me, a fierce, newly ignited fire burning brightly in her dark eyes. She nodded slowly, her posture straightening. "Claire is right, Father. A quick death is far too easy for him. I want him to feel the exact same agonizing terror, isolation, and helplessness he forced upon me." With our rules of engagement set, we relocated to a makeshift subterranean command center hidden deep within the General's bunker. It was a paranoid data analyst's ultimate dream, lined floor to ceiling with encrypted monitors, fully air-gapped workstations, and autonomous servers that did not officially exist on any government registry. I cracked my knuckles, sat down in the leather chair, and immediately went to work. To break a man like Julian, I needed to force him into a state of blind panic. I needed to make him reckless. "Julian is an absolute control freak," Maya noted, standing closely over my shoulder and analyzing the glowing screens. "If he even suspects his money is moving without his direct, explicit permission, he will completely lose his mind." "Then let us give him a terrifying ghost to chase," I said, my fingers flying rapidly across the mechanical keyboard. Using a deeply buried, unauthorized backdoor I had secretly installed on the Aegis secondary servers 8 months ago to bypass my overbearing boss, I seamlessly slipped unnoticed into the Horizon Data Network. From there, it was a straight, entirely unmonitored jump into Julian's supposedly impenetrable offshore routing protocols. My first target was his highly guarded, hidden stock portfolio located in Geneva, Switzerland. I did not attempt to steal the funds. A direct theft would trigger immediate institutional lockdowns and alert international authorities. Instead, I utilized a heavily encrypted, anonymous routing network to surgically inject a highly sophisticated piece of malware directly into his automated trading algorithms. The parasitic code was designed for one specific purpose: to create massive, phantom financial fluctuations. To Julian viewing his private executive dashboard, it would look exactly as though tens of millions of dollars were rapidly evaporating and mysteriously reappearing in unauthorized shell accounts every few minutes. I hit the enter key. The terminal screen flashed a brilliant green. The invisible digital poison had been successfully released into the financial bloodstream of his pristine empire. The trap was meticulously set, and the untouchable predator was now officially the prey. For 72 agonizing hours, Julian Sterling lived in a state of absolute, manufactured chaos. Deep within the fortified walls of his Seattle headquarters, red alert banners screamed across his private, air-gapped monitors. The phantom malware I had injected into his Swiss routing protocols performed its dark magic flawlessly, striking with the precision of a scalpel. To his compliance officers, nothing was wrong. The external ledgers balanced perfectly. But on Julian's encrypted executive dashboard, tens of millions of dollars appeared to be hemorrhaging out of his offshore accounts, only to ghost back in a matter of minutes. He could not trace the leak. He could not stop the bleeding. Driven by his own pathological need for total dominance, his paranoia metastasized rapidly. The psychological warfare was working. He began firing his closest advisors, aggressively interrogating his loyal board members, and tearing his inner circle apart, looking for a traitor that simply did not exist. The pressure was mounting to a critical mass, but we needed him to make a fatal error. We needed him to open a direct, unmonitored channel to his deepest data vault so I could slip inside. That was when Maya stepped up. She had spent the last 2 years flinching at shadows, terrified of her own reflection. But the woman standing next to me in the subterranean bunker was no longer a victim. She was a weapon. "I know exactly how to make him panic," she said, her voice completely devoid of fear, her eyes locked on the glowing monitors. She drafted an anonymous email using a highly secure, untraceable server farm located overseas. The message contained no threats, no manifestos, and absolutely no demands for money. It was just a single line of text, a complex alphanumeric cipher based on the exact date and coordinates of their private honeymoon in Monaco, combined with the specific serial number of the hidden ledger she had accidentally discovered 2 years prior. It was a digital ghost whispering his darkest, most closely guarded secret directly into his ear. We sent the email at exactly 3 a.m, his time. We sat in the freezing bunker, staring at a blank terminal screen, waiting for the trap to spring. Maya knew the architectural flaws of her ex-husband's mind better than anyone. Julian was far too arrogant to trust his elite cybersecurity team with his most damning secrets. When confronted with proof that his ultimate vault might be compromised, he would never ask an underling to investigate. He would have to check it himself. 45 minutes later, a silent, flashing red alarm triggered on my primary monitor. The bait had been taken. Julian had bypassed his corporate firewall and established a direct, localized handshake with his personal black site server. In his desperate, sweat-soaked rush to verify the safety of his illicit data, he failed to realize that the email contained a microscopic, self-executing tracking protocol. The moment he logged in, he unknowingly bridged the gap between his isolated vault and my terminal. He had just opened the back door and handed me the keys to his kingdom. My fingers hammered the mechanical keyboard in a frantic, rhythmic blur. I had perhaps 60 seconds before his automated intrusion countermeasures recognized the foreign breach and severed the connection permanently. I ripped through heavily encrypted directories, bypassing superficial decoy files, diving straight into the raw architecture of his personal drive. There were no standard accounting spreadsheets or neatly labeled folders. Julian was far too clever for that. But my extensive risk analysis training had taught me how to look for anomalies in file density. I found a massive, unusually dense string of data hidden deep within an encrypted digital art portfolio. It was a non-fungible token, a highly expensive piece of digital artwork he had ostensibly purchased for $7 million at an exclusive charity auction. I isolated the smart contract code and ran a rapid, aggressive decryption script. The artwork was nothing but a hollow shell. Concealed perfectly within the hexadecimal source code of the image file was an electronic ledger. It was a master document detailing every bribe to federal regulators, every money laundering operation routed through shell companies, and the exact payment records to the corrupt psychiatrists who had fabricated Maya's medical evaluation. I initiated a forced, complete download, mirroring the entire horrific structure onto our secure military drives. The progress bar crept forward with agonizing slowness. 10%, 40%, 80%. Done. I pulled the digital cord, severing our connection into the void just milliseconds before his internal firewalls began to scream. But Julian was a billionaire with endless resources, and a cornered rat will always bite. Less than 4 hours after the infiltration, an emergency proximity alarm flared to life on one of the general's secondary surveillance monitors. "They traced the breach," the general announced, his voice carrying the icy, terrifying calm of a seasoned warlord. Despite my heavy encryption protocols, Julian's elite security team had managed to grab a fragmented piece of my digital footprint, tracking the connection backward through the labyrinth. But they did not trace it to the bunker in Idaho. They traced it to the dummy router I had deliberately left running in my apartment in Spokane. Julian immediately dispatched a highly specialized wetwork team to eliminate the threat. High-resolution satellite feeds displayed 3 black, unmarked vehicles pulling into my old, snow-covered neighborhood. Heavily armed men in tactical gear moved silently up the rusted fire escape and kicked down the door to my apartment, expecting to find a rogue hacker or a terrified whistleblower begging for mercy. They found nothing but an empty cold room and a blinking piece of plastic. What they did not know was that General Vance was a master of asymmetrical warfare, and I had planned for this exact counterattack. The moment the hit squad crossed the threshold, heavy titanium shutters slammed down over the windows and doors, sealing them inside a reinforced cage. My apartment had been rigged as a giant, inescapable rat trap. Before the assassins could even raise their suppressed weapons, heavily armored tactical units belonging to the general breached from the adjacent apartments. Flashbang grenades detonated with blinding, bone-rattling force. Within 90 seconds, the entire extraction team was neutralized, disarmed, and zip-tied face down to the floorboards. Julian had sent his absolute best wolves, and they had walked blindly into a slaughterhouse. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the raw, decoded ledger glowing brightly on the screen. The battlefield was completely clear. I possessed every single piece of evidence required to bury Julian Sterling under a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. His assassins were gone. His ultimate secret was captured, and the untouchable titan of the tech industry sat alone in his penthouse, completely blind to the fact that an invisible, unbreakable noose had just tightened securely around his throat. The grand ballroom of the Emerald City Sovereign, a flawless 5-star hotel situated in the beating heart of downtown Seattle, was a breathtaking monument to obscene wealth and manufactured prestige. High above the polished marble floors, massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden illumination over a sea of custom-tailored tuxedos and glittering designer gowns. Waiters in immaculate white coats glided silently through the crowd, balancing silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and glasses of vintage champagne that cost more than a standard mortgage payment. Soft, live classical music drifted from a string quartet tucked into a heavily floral-draped alcove, masking the predatory hum of high-level networking. This was the crowning jewel of Julian Sterling's carefully constructed universe. Tonight was the official public announcement of his multi-billion-dollar corporate merger with the federal government. 500 of the most powerful politicians, military contractors, and Wall Street investors had gathered to witness the ascension of a man they believed to be a visionary philanthropist. I stood in the shadowed archway of the mezzanine, looking down at the glittering snake pit. I wore a sharp, structured charcoal evening gown, a sartorial echo of the armor I used to wear in the corporate boardrooms, but standing next to me was the true weapon of the night. Maya was unrecognizable. The trembling, emaciated fugitive from the freezing Spokane parking lot had been entirely erased. Tonight, she was draped in a breathtaking floor-length gown of deep emerald silk that moved like liquid fire around her feet. Her posture was ramrod straight, her chin held high with the undeniable, terrifying grace of a woman who had walked through hell and returned to burn the devil. Around her neck rested a simple, blindingly expensive diamond pendant, a quiet testament to the restored financial might of General Marcus Vance. We did not have to sneak in. We were officially registered as elite VIP guests, smoothly ushered through the heavy biometric security checkpoints by the General's invisible, omnipotent influence. Down on the floor, Julian was holding court. He looked the part of the flawless savior perfectly, his hair impeccably styled, his smile warm and utterly devoid of a soul. He was speaking animatedly to a prominent four-star general and a federal regulatory chairman, holding a crystal flute of champagne in his manicured hand. "Ready?" I whispered, my voice completely steady. "Let us burn it down," Maya replied, her eyes locked onto the man who had stolen 2 years of her life. We stepped out of the shadows and began our descent down the grand sweeping staircase. The movement caught the attention of a few guests, then a dozen, and suddenly, the ambient noise in the massive ballroom began to dramatically quiet down. Maya possessed an unnatural magnetic gravity. As we reached the polished marble of the main floor, the crowd organically parted for us like the Red Sea. Julian was laughing at a joke made by the federal chairman when his gaze casually drifted toward the disturbance in the crowd. His eyes met Maya's. The physical reaction was instantaneous and violently visceral. The color completely drained from his perfectly tanned face, leaving him looking like a freshly embalmed corpse. His jaw went slack. The pristine crystal champagne flute slipped from his paralyzed fingers, shattering against the marble floor with a sharp, explosive crack that echoed through the sudden silence of the room. Golden liquid splashed across his polished Italian leather shoes. For 3 agonizing seconds, the untouchable titan of the tech industry simply froze, his mind violently short-circuiting as he stared at the ghost of the woman he had buried alive. He knew his elite hit squad had missed their target. He knew she had survived, but his sheer arrogance prevented him from understanding the lethal magnitude of what was about to happen next. A frantic public relations manager quickly ushered a bewildered Julian toward the main stage, desperately trying to save the highly choreographed schedule. The lights in the grand ballroom slowly dimmed, plunging the audience into a theatrical, expectant hush. Julian gripped the sides of the lucite podium, his knuckles turning chalk white. He took a shaky breath, forcing the manufactured, charismatic mask back onto his face. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice wavering slightly before he stabilized it with sheer, desperate willpower. "Tonight, we are not just merging companies. We are revolutionizing the very fabric of medical technology. We are building a future where no patient is left behind, where transparency and absolute moral integrity guide our every decision. Please, direct your attention to the screens to see the dawn of our new era." He gestured grandly to the massive, theater-sized LED display suspended above the stage. He expected a swelling orchestral score and a highly produced montage of smiling doctors and pristine laboratories. Instead, the speakers unleashed a sharp, deafening burst of digital static. The screen flashed blindingly white, then snapped to a harsh, unforgiving black terminal window. My viral payload, triggered remotely from the phone in my evening bag, violently hijacked the hotel's entire audio-visual system. Huge, glowing green text began to rapidly scroll down the massive screen. It was not a promotional video. It was the raw, unredacted architecture of his digital soul, the master ledger. The system began aggressively displaying high-resolution scans of wire transfers, highlighting the exact routing numbers moving millions of dollars from fake charitable foundations into offshore shell accounts in the Cayman Islands. Then, the screen violently shifted. It displayed explicit, highly encrypted email chains between Julian and the chief psychiatric evaluator of a private medical facility. The text was magnified 1,000 times for the entire room to read. "Double the payment to the clinic," the email from Julian read, glowing brightly in the dark room. "I do not care what chemicals you have to pump into her system. Maya must be diagnosed as permanently, violently psychotic by Friday. Keep her locked down. I need full custody of the boy and absolute control of the trust before the merger audit." A collective, horrified gasp ripped through the darkness of the ballroom. The silence was instantly shattered by a rising, chaotic crescendo of panicked whispers. The string quartet stopped playing. The screen shifted one final time, displaying a live, real-time feed of Julian's primary stock portfolio. The entire room watched in morbid fascination as the automated Swiss trading algorithms I had infected days ago began rapidly, aggressively dumping his holding shares. The graph plummeted in a straight, terrifying red line. Billions of dollars in market valuation were being systematically vaporized before their very eyes. The elite crowd erupted into absolute pandemonium. Wealthy investors began frantically shouting into their cellular phones, screaming at their brokers to pull every single dime of capital immediately. The federal regulatory chairman, realizing he was standing in the middle of a political nuclear blast radius, turned pale, signaled his security detail, and practically sprinted toward the emergency exits to avoid the radioactive fallout. The military brass followed suit, abandoning the ballroom like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Julian was hyperventilating, his eyes wide and bloodshot, sweat pouring down his forehead and ruining his expensive suit. The illusion was dead. The empire was ashes. Driven by pure, unadulterated madness, he abandoned the podium. He scrambled to the edge of the stage, intending to run toward the back-of-house control room in a pathetic, delusional attempt to physically smash the servers and stop the bleeding. He vaulted off the low stage and landed heavily on the plush red carpet of the center aisle. He took exactly one desperate, sprinting step forward. I calmly stepped out of the crowd and thrust my right heel directly into his path. His shin collided violently with my foot. Julian lost his balance entirely, flying forward and crashing face first onto the red carpet with a heavy, sickening thud. He slid a few feet, his expensive silk tie tangling around his neck, gasping for air like a dying fish. I stood over him, looking down at the pathetic, broken creature scrambling on his hands and knees. He looked up at me, his face bruised, his eyes filled with a pathetic, helpless terror. The invincible billionaire was completely gone. I opened my small silver clutch, reaching inside to pull out a crumpled, faded piece of thermal paper. I let it slip through my fingers. The cheap Walmart receipt drifted slowly through the air, landing perfectly on the red carpet mere inches from his bleeding nose. I looked down into his terrified eyes and smiled, my voice carrying the freezing, lethal calm of a winter storm. "You know," I said softly, ensuring he heard every single word over the screaming crowd, "your freedom was cheaper than I thought. It only cost me $148.22. Julian stared at the receipt, his mind unable to process the total destruction of his life. Before he could even formulate a scream, the heavy double doors of the ballroom burst open. Dozens of federal agents flooded the room, their tactical gear a stark contrast to the glittering evening wear of the fleeing guests. I had anonymously forwarded the decrypted master ledger to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cyber Division 3 hours before the party started. The agents did not hesitate. They hauled Julian roughly to his feet. The cold, heavy click of steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed through the chaos. He thrashed and roared, screaming threats and demanding his lawyers, but his voice was completely drowned out by the reading of his Miranda rights. His cruel, untouchable empire was officially dead. 6 months later, the legal slaughter was absolute. Julian was sentenced to 120 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. Every single attempt his high-priced legal team made to bribe judges or intimidate witnesses was quietly, ruthlessly crushed by the supreme, invisible influence of General Vance. Julian lost his billions, his reputation, and his freedom forever. Maya reclaimed her life. With her legal assets fully restored, she founded a specialized technology security foundation. Her organization provided encrypted data protection and safe digital havens for women trapped in domestic abuse and financial isolation. The crushing weight of fear was gone from her eyes. Back in the snowy mountains of Idaho, the general's massive mansion was no longer a cold fortress. It was a home. The joyful, echoing laughter of little Leo, chasing the security dogs through the grand hallways, finally erased the bitter, tragic misunderstandings that had fractured their family for 2 years. As for me, General Vance offered me a blank check. I politely declined his millions. I did not want to be beholden to anyone's power ever again. I smiled, packed my bags, and returned to my quiet life in Spokane. I kept my job at Aegis Vanguard Analytics, but the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. My arrogant boss mysteriously resigned after a sudden, extremely aggressive internal audit, and I was swiftly promoted to the head of the risk management division. I finally had the respect and the peace I deserved. Life moved on. On a freezing Tuesday night, I found myself walking down the brightly lit aisles of my local Walmart to grab some groceries. As I stood in the checkout line, I noticed a young mother standing at the register in front of me. She was frantically digging through a worn, oversized tote bag, desperately searching for enough loose change to cover a large box of diapers. Her cheeks flushed bright red with embarrassment as the cashier waited impatiently. I smiled gently. I stepped forward, sliding my credit card onto the scanner. Sometimes, the most terrifying monsters in the world are not brought down by armies or brilliant corporate strategies. Sometimes, a single tiny act of kindness is the spark needed to burn an evil empire to the ground and light the way for those who need it most. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Vivian Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we would love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you are listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.